Welcome back to the Gloria Ferrer Masterclass series. Tonight, I'm here with Brad Kurtz, our Director of Vineyards, and my name is Kyle Tamari, the winemaker here at Gloria Ferrer. We have an exciting lineup for you of everything new, fun, exciting, and innovative that we've been working on. Brad, tonight we're going to talk about growing grapes outside of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which is what we do most of. We're going to talk about new varieties that you've got on the ranch. We're going to talk about experimentation, different vessels, all these fun things. We've got some fun wine in our glasses. Let's go ahead and pop these bottles
crack into it
and get rolling.
Awesome.
I wanted to talk to you first. So Pinot Noir Chardonnay is what we do most of, right? That is
That's our bread and butter.
Ranch. Yeah. But we have some other varietals, some that have been here for quite some time and some that are new. So launch in and talk to me about what other than Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is on the ranch.
So the big one would be Pinot Blanc. Pinot Blanc is a variety that we have been growing here for at least 30 years.
Yeah, it's been a while.
In varying capacities, whether they're small 1 acre blocks. Now we've got about 4.5 acres of Pinot Blanc. Pinot Blanc is a champagne grape. It is one of the varieties allowed to be produced included in blends for champagne production. It's not a classic champagne variety.
More of a filler.
It's more of a filler, a blender. It serves a purpose. It's traditionally used more in sparkling wines out of Alsace. So it is a grape that can produce phenomenal sparkling wines, but it isn't your classic sparkling wine grape. It is something we've had on the property, like I mentioned, for a long time. So it's something we have a lot of experience with. Traditionally, we've made still wine out of it. We've gone for a more stainless steel, very acid-driven, fresh still wine that we've produced with the Pinot Blanc. But we are experimenting with it now. And so we have the Pinot Blanc, and recently, as of 2023, we now have Malvasia Bianca.
Okay.
And a lot of people know we have been producing Malvasia Bianca for a few years now from purchased fruit, and we made the investment to go ahead and plant some Malvasia Bianca vineyards. Malvasia Bianca is a variety that is a Mediterranean variety. It's a little warmer climate variety. Carneros is a cooler climate region. So we planted it in very small amounts. We've got about 2 acres in the ground now between 2 very small blocks on different parts of the ranch to basically see where it goes, where it grows well, where we can produce the best quality. Will it ripen fully? What can we do with it? Sparkling wine, still wine, sweet wine, whatever it may be. We're trying to figure that out. We, of course, have talked about how we see the climate changing and we're having different growing conditions every year. And this gives us the opportunity to diversify from all cool climate varieties to something of a warm climate variety. We had a little bit of heat wave in October, which it wasn't anything crazy, but it was definitely warm for about a week, really warm, unseasonably warm in October for about a week. And
high 90s.
Yeah, high 90s, which for Carneros in October is really abnormal.
When you get that more direct sunlight late in the season, it feels unseasonably hot.
We were done with harvest, but the vines are still out there, hanging out there, and you could see the stress in the Pinot and Chardonnay. And then driving by these young Malvasia vines, they were just loving it. They were loving it. They were growing like crazy.
They were going crazy.
They were happy. They were soaking up that sunshine. So having the Malvasia Bianca out there is something of a, hedging our bets, experimenting. It's an innovation wine. It's something that's different that we're doing and we're trying. And we're just going to see what it does. And so, it was something we committed to planting 2 acres. It's a small portion of the property, but we're all about experimentation and innovation. And so it's giving us an opportunity to do that, to experiment and innovate. And if it doesn't work, you're not throwing the whole ranch away.
Yep.
It's 2 acres, but it's something that I think is valuable that we have to do. And we put them strategically in different places on the ranch.
Yep.
A cooler site on the clay soils, a warmer, earlier ripening site on the rockier soils, just to kind of see what the difference is in those 2 different blocks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even more of an investment for you on the vineyard side than it is on the winemaking side, right? Because you've got such a long lead up time. And you want to make sure that when you're doing this, you're starting at something that we don't know if it's going to be commercially viable. We don't know if it's even going to work here. So the rule is always proof of concept first, right? And taking 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before we even see proof of concept and doing it in such a small range is a testament to the fact that we're always trying to push the boundary, right? We're thinking about this in a critical way that makes it it's intentional, but it's also fun, right? We got to have something that's just a little bit different. So when you're growing these, right? Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, we've said bread and butter, we've got that down. What kind of stylistic differences do you have, or pruning differences? Is there anything different about growing these varieties? High-toned aromatics, right? So we do have to be pretty careful. But talk to me about, do we prune differently? What do we do differently when we're growing these?
So Malvasia Bianca is a different beast altogether, right? It is not in the Pinot Noir Chardonnay family at all.
Yep.
It's Mediterranean warm climate variety.
Humongous clusters.
Humongous clusters, big berries. It's almost reminiscent of a table grape, like a bunch of table grapes. But very aromatic, tons of florals. That gets treated completely differently. Pinot Blanc is essentially Pinot Noir's, white-skinned cousin. Pinot Noir being the red variant and Pinot Blanc being the white variant. They're genetically almost identical though. So we treat Pinot Blanc very similarly in a way that we would treat Pinot Noir. The only difference is because Pinot Noir has that pigment in the skins, it gives it a little extra protection from the sun. When we have those hot days, the direct sunlight, it almost shields. It almost shields it. Where if you're from a Mediterranean climate, and you got a darker skin tone, you might not burn as easily. It's very similar with grapes, and so the Pinot Blanc, we have to be so careful when it comes to sunburn. It's even more sensitive than Chardonnay when it comes to sunburn, and it's such a delicate grape. And delicate flavors within that grape, that little bit of sunburn can really create a lot of bitterness in the wine.
Yeah.
Can create astringency in the wines. So we're really careful with leaf removal, making sure we grow a big canopy to shade the fruit, and making sure the vines aren't super stressed throughout the season, because it is such a, and you want to make sure they're happy so they produce those lovely aromatics that Pinot Blanc can produce.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that's one variety when it hits the crush pad, we're both always out there making sure that, you guys sort in the field a lot when we're hand picking, because we have our own crew. You guys do a great job of actually taking the stuff out, or even just not picking the stuff that we don't want. But that's definitely one that sunburn is at the top of our minds. When it hits the crush pad, it's like, it's a game time decision, right? Are we going to bring out the sorting table? Are we just going to let this go direct to press? And we have a lot of tools that we can mitigate that sunburn, but it's something we definitely want to get out early on.
And Pinot Blanc, something we have a long history here with, but we're just we've done the same thing for a long time, but we're just sort of now starting to play around with it and get to know the varietal beyond its classic still wine form. Yeah. So, right now we're drinking the Illumina, which is our fairly newly released sparkling Pinot Blanc, and this wine is quickly became a team favorite. This is our inside knowledge. It's very different from our standard Gloria Ferrer wines. I mean, we have our Pinot and Chardonnay based blends and our Pinot and Chardonnay kind of standalone wines. Yeah. This wine is in left field when it comes to those. It's a similar genetically, and in the vineyard it's very similar to Pinot Noir, but in the cellar and in the glass, it is dramatically different.
It's wildly different. I mean, you get all of those really high-tone thiolytic aromatics, and the white flowers, the peach, the stone fruit, which
it's so pretty.
You don't go any red at all. This is very yellow fruit, white fruit. It's beautiful.
And I think where Chardonnay can be like citrus, this is more like stone fruit.
It's soft. It's like ripe summer peach, like
melon.
That 2-week window you get with peaches and other stone fruits, where it's like that's the best time of the season. That's what comes out in these.
For me, Chardonnay in sparkling wine is all about its green apple and its citrus, specifically like lemon lime citrus. This I get barely any of that. This is, to me, I always go melon. To me, it's like honeydew melon, cantaloupe. It can be kind of like that flavor profile. So we're just kind of we're learning very quickly about this as a sparkling wine varietal. And so we have our 4-acre vineyard. It's sitting kind of in the middle in that Goldilocks soil zone. It's kind of on some of the better sparkling wine soils on the home ranch. And now we've got it split for still wine. We got it split for sparkling, and we even left a little bit out there.
That's the sneak preview of what's coming this year.
Yeah, of late harvest, just to experiment. What does that look like when we leave it out even longer, and how do those flavors develop?
We can actually bring up the map, because we can talk about where we've talked about that Goldilocks zone of like you said, where the soils are perfect. But this is just one specific block. So we have 3 wines coming off of this block. It's in dark green on the map here on the call here, but 3 wines from the same block. It's fairly uniform all the way through.
Yeah, it's
How do we
beautiful
split
vineyard.
it?
Yeah, so we basically are splitting it starting from pruning, right? Because we're pruning it differently. For the sparkling wine section, our goals are a little bit different than the still wine. And then the late harvest, we have to treat extremely differently because that we're trying to get very, very ripe and develop super concentrated flavors. And that was the first year. I mean, the reason why we did it is last year the crew missed a couple clusters out there, and we came back in November and tasted that fruit, and we were blown away
oh my God.
by the flavors, and it was so different than anything we'd ever had.
Yeah.
And we said, well, we got to save a couple tons out here. We'll let it hang out there, and we'll pick it once the sugars and flavors accumulate to the point that we're looking for.
Yeah.
But as far as sparkling wine goes, I've been really blown away by this varietal, and I'm excited about what we're going to be doing. I mean, this is really our first attempt at it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's like I said, this is what we crack open when we're sitting on the terrace. This is what we go for. This is what I reach for.
Yeah.
Especially during the summer. I mean,
it's a crushable wine, that's for sure. You can, it drinks so differently than the other classic, let's call them classic varietals that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more linear. It's much more zippy. It's very
delicate
focused.
too. Very delicate.
Yes, and it's soft.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just inherently soft on the palate. There is a touch of Chardonnay in here just for a little bit of structure. As you know, when you're putting it down for over a year, and Tirage, you need a little bit of structure there. And as you mentioned,
but you don't really get any of the characteristics from the Chardonnay in this. I mean, it's to me, this is all about Pinot Blanc, and this is a wine that I'm excited to continue to produce.
Oh yeah,
and continue to grow the grapes for. And 21, this is a 2021, and this was our first year of transitioning to organic farming systems. And this is something that, you know, you can see the quality in the wine, and it really stands apart from our other wines in the portfolio. Yeah. So a fun innovation wine, and it's something, you know, when we're looking at innovating by producing different varietals, this is, I think, the standout winner of anything we've produced thus far. It's my go-to for sparkling wine innovations.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So you help me a lot when we're talking about innovation on the winemaking side and how we can carry through, even within Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, how we can grow things differently to get a different outcome, right? But there is also some innovation that we're doing in the vineyard. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about, I know the biggest thing, and you and I have had a lot of conversations about this in our office and just messing around and talking about things, but there's a lot of things that I think especially winemakers, but sometimes even vineyard managers overlook that you're really passionate about. And one of them is rootstock, right?
Yeah.
So talk to me about what we have going in the ground, because we talked last time when we were talking redevelopment strategy, there's a lot that goes into it, and that literally roots in the ground is the first thing that we have to talk about. So talk to me about the trials you're doing with rootstock to figure out, not only for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but are these varieties, the Malvasia Bianca and Pinot Blanc, on different rootstock than Pinot Noir?
Yeah, so for me, I think about rootstock as you have to match the site, namely the climate and the soils. Our vineyards are all essentially one climate. We've got some frost issues in a couple parts of the vineyard, and we got some maybe a little warmer nights up on the hillsides, but essentially I consider it all very uniform as far as climate goes. Rainfall's the same, temperatures are relatively similar. Soils is the big variable, right? Our soils are the big variable. The soils change dramatically from the hillsides above the winery down to the Arnold Drive and the highway in front of the winery. And so we have to look at those and look at which rootstocks will perform the best. We also have to look at things like, these are not virgin soils anymore, right? When the property was first developed, when you're going into what was cattle pasture for eternity before this, you have very fertile soils.
Very high level of nutrition.
But when you're going in to replant for the second or third time, these are kind of depleted soils. Some of them deal with compaction issues. The heavy clays can be very difficult to farm in.
Water likes to settle.
Water likes to settle, and then they're rock solid during the summer when they dry out. So we really need to pick the rootstock. The other thing we need to take into consideration is our goals, right? What is our fruit goals? Are we producing Cabernet, where we're looking for a really concentrated Cabernet? Are we producing Chardonnay for still wine? Are we producing Chardonnay for sparkling wine, or Pinot Noir for sparkling wine, or Pinot Blanc for sparkling wine? So you got to look at variety, site, soils, and what are your winemaking goals from that vineyard. So All these things we have to look at. And when you look at all these things, we're very different from the rest of the industry.
Yes.
Because our goals are very different. Our goals are very different than someone who's producing Chardonnay for still wine or Cabernet for red wine. And our soils are very different. Because our goals are different, what we're looking at here, we farm soils that are very different than your typical vineyard soils. So what I have to do is then look at not what are the popular rootstocks and the common rootstocks that people use, but what are the best rootstocks for our sites and our goals. Because rootstock, first and foremost, drives the health of the plant and how that plant utilizes and grows in that soil.
Yep.
There's devigorating rootstocks and there's invigorating rootstocks, drought tolerant and non-drought tolerant rootstocks. So you have to look at rootstocks that handle certain pests and diseases. We're pretty lucky where we don't have too many, but so we're doing a lot of experimentation right now. We essentially, how I look at it is we have about 3 or 4 different soil types on the property and which rootstocks work best with which varieties in those soil types. So doing a lot of experimentation.
And then you've also got compatibility issues.
Compatibility issues,
if the cultivar is not compatible with the rootstock, you're in for a big
and that's something
problem.
that was happened in the past here. Where they put Pinot Noir on a certain rootstock that it wasn't compatible with, and they had big problems in the vineyards for a long time.
So if that happens, what happens when you get into that situation, right? Like let's say you plant something, maybe there wasn't enough research, maybe it was something you just didn't think about. If you get into a spot where you start to see some deficiencies from that, what can you do? Can you fix it, or do you have to rip it all the way out?
Well, yes, you can rip it all the way out. That's always an option. That's not the ideal option, right? The ideal option is you figure out how you can better nurse those vines back to health, or you can graft below the original graft union and put a new variety or a new clone in. There's options there. You can irrigate differently. You can treat the soil differently. There's a lot of things you can do.
And then just so we're on the same page, talk to me, what is grafting?
Yeah, so grafting is typically what we do is you would not want to plant a Pinot Noir vine directly into our soils here. A Pinot Noir vine is not resistant to the #1 grapevine pest, which is phylloxera. So if you were to, theoretically, you could take a cutting, and not theoretically, we've done it many times.
I've seen you do it.
You could take a cutting of a dormant cane off a Pinot Noir vine, stick it in the ground, and it will grow roots and it will produce a vine. That's how cloning is done. What happens when you do that is the phylloxera is a root louse. It's an insect that will feed on the roots and eventually kill the vine. We use resistant rootstocks. So we use hybrids of different species of grapevines that are adapted to North American pests, which phylloxera is a North American pest, that they can tolerate the root louse feeding on the roots of the vine, and you can still produce a healthy vine off of it. So what we do first is we do that same thing. Instead of taking a Pinot Noir cutting, we take a cutting of one of these varieties or hybrids of these varieties, and we stick it in the ground, and that grows roots. And then we take our Pinot Noir and we graft on the Pinot Noir to that established rootstock.
So you literally just make a cut, put it on there.
We make a slice into that side of the rootstock. We take one bud of the Pinot Noir, you wrap it up, you wait for it to callus onto the side of the rootstock, and then you cut the top of the old vine off, and then you have one bud. All those established roots go into one little bud on the side, and you grow up a whole new vine off of that one bud that is 100% Pinot Noir.
That's awesome. So we have some options here. So
yeah.
Okay, cool. And talk to me, how many different rootstocks are you trying as we're going into this? Because we have new varieties that we're looking at because of climate change, right? And as these vintages become a bit more squirrely, and you've seen it since you've been here. It's
for sure.
Well, especially with all the ground squirrels that we have. So it goes up, it goes down. The highs are becoming higher, the lows are becoming lower. It's a little bit different. How many different rootstocks are you actually looking at?
Yeah, we're looking at about 7 or 8 different rootstocks right now. And I think, innovating with experimentation, I think planting a vineyard, you're making a minimum 25-year investment. You're making a decision that is you're stuck with for 25 years. You want to make sure you do it right. So what I typically do is I will plant a vineyard in that soil series, and I will take one row, and I'll plant a rootstock that I know will work there. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not the best choice for that site, but I know because there's other vineyards that were there before, or there's vineyards next to it that work with that rootstock. and I'll plant that, and then I might plant 1 or 2 rows of different rootstocks in there, and I will be able to compare them side by side.
And we can see as
And
we're
you can
walking
see,
through,
you walk down the row and you can see the difference in growth. You can see how they ripen differently. You can see how the vigor of the vines changes, how they react to irrigations, things like that. Certain rootstocks go deep down in the soil. Certain rootstocks spread wide. Certain rootstocks create very small root systems, big root systems. So all those types of things are things we have to take into consideration and we're looking at. But you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket if you don't know what those eggs are like. Yeah. And so you really want to make sure you test everything first. Always be experimenting in the vineyard.
And you have to do it on a small scale. So
always start on a small scale and then proof of concept. Once you prove it works, then you can start planting larger vineyards with it. But I rarely ever will take a rootstock that I have no experience with on a certain soil type with a certain variety and plant a whole vineyard to that, because it's just a risky move. And like I said, you're making 25 to 50 year investment by doing this, and once you put it in the ground, you can't change it. If I have to tear up 1 row and replant it, it's not the end of the world. If I have to tear up 100 rows, then we're talking about a real big issue, right?
Yeah, repairs and maintenance versus capital.
Yeah, you're talking about repairs, or you're talking about a significant investment, reinvestment that you're going to have to make,
and the loss of production,
and the loss of production. Yeah, exactly. So 1 row versus 100 rows is a big difference, and that's why it's all about experimentation and proving what you do works, especially when we're talking of these obscure rootstocks where there's not a huge body of research out there, where there's not a ton of experience out there, where I can go to, UC Davis extension specialist and I could say, hey, what do you know about this rootstock with Pinot Noir in clay?
Sure.
There's no research out there.
Well, and that's the thing, is a lot of these articles or this research is coming from the UC Davis extension or the Oakville experimental vineyard, right? Which is completely different than we have on our site here. The goals of that research and the goals of that experiment are completely different than the goals of the experiment that we have here. So
absolutely,
first-hand experimentation is always
experimenting for your goals, right?
Yes.
You have to know what your goals are as a grape grower. What is your final, what is the final outcome of these grapes going to be? And let's plant the vineyard specifically for that. Malvasia Bianca, for instance. Malvasia is a very vigorous variety that's a heavy producer. I planted it on very tight spacing because I want those vines to compete with each other. And I know if I don't, we're going to have massive yields and we're going to have diluted wines. So we're planting them in a tighter spacing for that purpose, to help them compete with each other and help them struggle a little bit, because in these cool, wet Carneros climate, they're going to really explode in vigor and production. And we have to really battle them, beat them back so that they create concentrated wines, especially for still wine production.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, and that's why it's so important working so closely together, because if I don't have insight into the vineyard, you don't have insight into the end goals.
Yes.
We kind of don't. We're running parallel, but we're not working
one straight path.
Exactly right. So here and you and I talk about this all the time, is how we're already starting it for 25. How are we going to prune? What kind of tons per acre are we looking at? What blocks are we looking at for what specific program? What did we do well with the grading? What did we not do well with? How are we going to adjust? And it goes all the way through on the innovation side as well, right? Because when we have all of those, we have house style, right? When we have Royal Cuvée, we have Carneros Cuvée. Those are established styles. They work really, really well. We have to be very careful when we're changing anything when it comes to those wines. Especially, again, those wines sit for 5 to 7 years in tirage. It's a long time. So the feedback loop is much, much shorter, or much, much longer. You get much less feedback per wine that you make on those than something like the innovation tier, right?
So talking about the innovation tier and talking about, like you just mentioned, the Royal Cuvée, Carneros Cuvée, Sonoma Brew, all these wines are styles that have been established.
Yeah.
And we have to, you don't want to mess with the blend. You don't want to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
Yeah.
They're great wines. We don't want to mess that up by changing them.
Correct.
When you're starting with a new wine like this one, or our Barrica here, or the, Sencia, or any of these Arenisca, how do you establish because these are wines that you're creating essentially from blank slate.
Yeah, and
how do you establish a style for these wines? How do you go about that?
That's a really good question. And again, it has to start with this idea that you want to just push the boundary a little bit farther, right? When sparkling wine in barrel, it doesn't have the same phenolic profile, it doesn't have the same weight, doesn't have the same structure as we do with still wine. So you have to be much more nuanced. We can't use the same coopers. We can't use the same forests. We can't do all of the things exactly the same because your impact is so much higher. So it has to come with an idea, and this idea always comes from collaboration, right? You know how it's being here. A lot of these things are just thrown around in these leadership meetings that we have, working, as a team to say, we have this idea that we want to take something and craft something that's different. A lot of this comes from what is intriguing to us as a team.
Because you and I sit down and we come up with about 40 different innovation wine ideas a year. And
and about one
by the end of the year, it gets whittled down to about one or two.
Then reality sets in and we're like, we actually have to produce this.
Yeah, exactly. So you and I come up with, we sit down and we spitball and we're like, oh, we should do this, we should do that.
Yeah, but you whittle it. You start wide, right?
Yes.
You always start very wide. What if we did this varietal? And then it's a thought experiment. Okay, what's that varietal going to be aged in? How long do you want to age it for? What kind of profile we're looking for? We often this is very tough on the sparkling side because it is so traditional. There's not a whole lot of other things out there, especially within the United States. So maybe you're going outside the United States.
Yeah,
maybe
to look for a comparative, a wine that's you can compare it to and draw inspiration
Exactly. You're drawing inspiration, and that's exactly it, because you're not trying to replicate it, right? I don't want to just go do something that someone else has done, but I do want to learn from what other people are doing and apply that to...
If they made mistakes, you don't want to make those same mistakes.
That's the big one, and apply it to our wines here at Gloria Ferrer, right? So a lot of times this is about following just a single thread. With Royal Cuvée, with Carneros Cuvée, with Sonoma Brut, balance, exceptional texture, length, right? We have all of these qualifiers that we put in when we're looking in the grading tasting. It has to be balanced. That's the number one. But with innovation wines, sometimes we can play around a little bit, and I call it intentionally unbalanced to find balance, where we get to follow a single thread. Like Alchemia is a great example of that. With Alchemia, it's all about just finding a single thread and going as far down the rabbit hole as you can.
Yeah, exactly.
Like their 2016, the acidity is screaming high, right? It's like, okay, so can we accentuate that? Can we take that even farther?
You're not trying to balance out that acidity. You're trying to highlight it.
How can we take that one thread and make it just like the solo, right? Where everything else is kind of like an orchestra of everything playing together and it all sounds perfect. Yeah. This is that jamming guitar solo that it's that one string, that one note that goes for a long, long time. So oftentimes it's just about tasting, using your palate.
Similar to the Barrica. It's we've played around with oak in blends and using neutral oak. This is about like, this has oak. This is...
The oak is the highlight here.
The oak is the highlight. It's not a balanced wine where the oak is integrated very well with the other components.
No.
It's, we've used oak in other blends where it's a 3% of the blend to add something. But this is like, no, we're going to highlight the oak in this one and you're going to taste it, and it's out of balance, but it's beautifully out of balance.
Yes, and that's exactly it, is trying to take it and showcase where fruit and purity of fruit in the estate are all the signatures, and texture are all the signatures of Royal Cuvée, Carneros Cuvée, Sonoma Brut, Brut Rosé, Blanc Blanc, things like that. This is showcasing a linear point. You want people to go home and be like, that is really cool, because you can get the oak. You see what happened and you see one side of the spectrum as opposed to trying to get it across the entire portfolio.
And we talk about like Sencia or Crisia, the wines that are zero dosage or Brut Nature. Those wines that have no sugar added in the dosage, we talk a lot about, you add a little bit of sugar to balance out the acidity in the wine. Those wines have zero sugar and they have screaming acidity, but they are such beautiful wines because they are unbalanced. They are so pretty and beautiful and different,
And those are really tough wines when you don't. It's a little bit easier when you have things like Pinot Blanc and you're trying to showcase varietal character, or Barrica and you're trying to showcase barrel character. When you have Sencia, for instance, Blanc de Blanc, 100%, and you don't have any sugar there, you really have to be careful about the components that go into that blend.
Yes.
How long are you going to age it for? You really have to think about this in terms of a total wine. And again, you want it to be unbalanced, but beautifully unbalanced, where you don't want it to be to the point where it's zero dosage for the sake of being zero dosage isn't very good. We want to craft a wine that is zero dosage and feels right.
Yeah, well, it's like the Illumina. It's sparkling Pinot Blanc, but we thought it would be better to put a little bit of Chardonnay in there.
Exactly.
And so you don't want to, this one maybe wasn't for the sake of just being 100% Pinot Blanc. You wanted to make a lovely wine too.
Yes.
But you're highlighting the Pinot Blanc.
It should still, that with Illumina, Pinot Blanc. You should stick your nose in glass, you should get Pinot Blanc, right? Barrica, you should stick your nose in the glass.
But you're not compromising the fact that it's going to be a good wine at the end of the day. Like when they were putting together the blends for this sparkling Pinot Blanc, clearly the 100% wasn't the answer. They thought it would be a better wine with a little bit of Chardonnay. Of course, that's not the highlight in this wine, but you're still trying to make a beautiful
use it
wine.
tactfully, right?
Yes.
And that's so, once you have that, the series is really just about trying things that you really want to figure out what's going to happen, right? So we have a sandstone sparkling coming out. So the thought was, okay, if there's barrel, and barrel has a certain oxygen permeation, then we get a little bit more oxidation there. What if I could do something that has more oxygen but doesn't have the oak flavor? Okay, well, sandstone comes in. What if we did something like a sparkling rouge? We did. I mean, you sat through the trials of the sparkling rouge.
That was a fun one. That was something that was really different.
So it's like, okay, what can we do that we take something and make it? I love when you can craft a wine that people go into it. We obviously shop with our eyes first, right?
Yeah.
So the rouge is a perfect, and this will be coming out in
and this is
years.
The rouge is a sparkling wine that is red in color. It's not a rosé. It is red in color.
It is red sparkling wine.
It looks like a red wine.
And people obviously shop with their eyes first. So you go into it with a certain perception, right? This is red wine and it's got bubbles. And we've tasted a lot of ones that were done where it's like we took a red wine and we put bubbles in it. And it can get a little rough, as you know.
Yeah.
So what we did when we were crafting ours is thinking about, okay, it's a red wine. Want it to smell like a red wine. Want it to look like a red wine. But when you taste it, I want it to drink like a rosé, right? Because it's fresh, it's crisp,
you get maybe those red wine flavors, but it drinks
it drinks like a rosé. It's soft, it's zippy, it's got higher acid, it's mineral driven, it's light, it's got great texture to it, a lot of length. So again, finding ways that you can innovation is really just about piquing different senses, right? Maybe we can have it look a different way, but taste a different way. And then it really opens up your mind to say, this is a really broad spectrum that we're working on. How far can we actually
And I think the other thing is like, it's maybe not something we're going to produce every year.
Yes.
But it's, you produce something, you see how the consumers react to it. If it's successful and we get great feedback, maybe we'll make it again next year. Maybe it'll be in 2 years or 3 years. Or maybe it never shows up again.
That's it.
And that's okay. That's why it's innovation. We're experimenting. We're trying something new. Like in the vineyards, we don't make 10,000 cases of these innovation wines. They're small production, and then you can grow from there if they are successful. I wanted to change gears a little bit and talk, because all of these wines have a very easy to understand thread.
Yep.
The Barrica is barrel driven.
It's barrel.
The Illumina is Pinot Blanc.
Yep.
The Rouge we talked about is a sparkling red wine. We've talked about the Sencia, the Caricia, zero dosage wines, very dry wines. Talk to me about the Method Ancestral, because I know that's coming out soon. It's something way out of left field that is so out of Gloria Ferrer's normal sparkling wine production. I want to talk about it a little bit and walk me through your thought process and walk me through your process of how, not only how you came up with the idea, but also how you executed this idea.
That was a fun project. You saw I was sleepless for quite some time. So Method Ancestral is produced this year for our 40th harvest, and it is a new take on an old production method. So traditionally, Method Ancestral would have been something that was by accident. It had actually happened. It started way back in the 1500s, and it was a very cold vintage. So, in the south of France, they had produced some wines, thought that the vintage was done, put it in bottle, put it under cork. Very cold winter, everything went to sleep. Come back in the spring, it warms up, and lo and behold, there's a little bit of sugar. They didn't have all the practical winemaking tools that we do now, or the quality control measures that we do now. Starts to re-ferment lightly, and bottles start exploding. Some that had less sugar stayed intact, things like that. But it was this proof of concept that, hey, you can ferment again when it's in the bottle. So taking that same premise and that same idea, we did the same thing. We took 2 blocks off the property. Our oldest block of Chardonnay and one of our older blocks of Pinot Noir that's since been redeveloped, but again, same area. Blended them in the press, and we put it down and we did the first fermentation in tank to a certain degree. So we put it down and we got it right to the sugar level we wanted. We have much more control over these fermentations now. But the intent was to replicate the same idea, right?
So you chill it down as it's getting close to finishing fermentation.
Exactly. And this is, I kind of call it landing the plane, because you're trying to stop a freight train, right? When fermentation gets rolling and sugar is being consumed at, over 12 to 15 grams per liter per day, and you're trying to hit a specific threshold.
The yeast are happy. They're going nuts. They're having a big party in the fermenter.
You kind of have to slowly bring it down until you have to make the call to hit it.
So you're chilling them down, and then it's the rate of fermentation is slowing little by little.
And then we arrest it completely in tank. And then differently, that we did different than anything else, was we put a little bit of riddling aid in there as well. So we could bottle it with the native yeast that was used from the first fermentation, bottle it, ferment it, right? We left it cold for a week.
Yeah, so you're taking it with a little bit of the sugars from the grape juice.
The natural sugars that are occurring in the grape.
And the yeast that were already fermenting that base wine. And you bottled it.
Put that all in bottle with a little bit of riddling aid. Let it rest for a week cold, then put it down in the caves to warm up. Come back up to temperature so it can finish fermenting. Again, simulating that same idea of how...
Simulating it's warming up in the spring.
Exactly. Accelerating the time period 2 months. So... and then riddle and disgorge so that you can have something that is from our 40th anniversary that you can drink in our 40th anniversary.
Yeah, so this is a wine that's fully disgorged.
It's fully disgorged.
Labeled, corked, ready to go. And it's a 2024 wine. And we're sitting here in November, middle of November. And we have a 2024 natural sparkling wine that is
going to be released.
Ready to be released.
And this all
which is bonkers.
This all came from the kind of idea that, like, at the end of harvest, we're beat, we're tired. But it's also a celebration. And a lot of places use Beaujolais Nouveau, right?
Yeah, it's essentially it's a Nouveau.
And that's exactly it. So it was like, okay, how can we take that and make something that fits for sparkling wine, right? How can we we're a sparkling house. Sparkling is what we do. We do make still wines, we do make these other things, but sparkling is what we're known for, what we're passionate about. How can we do our take on something like this and be innovative about it? So it's a little bit of a nod to history. It's a little bit of a nod to ancient production techniques. It's a little bit of a nod to the estate and how it was planted, and a little bit of a nod to just, hey, we're going to push the envelope here. And push the envelope we did, because that project was one where we went up, we went down, we went up.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I know it. I mean, we did this in 2023 with five cases as a proof of concept, and a 5-case production and a several 100-case production.
It's very different.
Are very different.
We learned that very quickly.
So it's one of those things where it's innovation, experimentation can come in different forms. It can come in aging vessels. It can come variety. It can come in winemaking styles from the zero dosage. And it can come from winemaking styles and a completely different method of producing. All of our sparkling wines that Gloria Ferrer has ever produced have been through traditional method. Now we're taking a left turn and we're saying, hey, look, we're going to try and do something and innovate by doing a method ancestral, which is so rare. And it's so difficult to pull off. And I think that's why it's so rare, is that it is so difficult to pull off.
And it still holds true to us, though, right? Because even though there's no secondary fermentation, you're finishing the fermentation in bottle. So
for thinking about this fermentation.
For thinking about any of these projects, I think the big thing is it's story driven, right? I think that I love telling stories. I love hearing stories. But I also love creating wines that have a different personality. And if you can find something that is that tells a story and has a different personality than anything else, I think there's a different resonance there when it comes to consumers, that it's like, hey, this may not be, ever 10,000 cases. It may not be like a cornerstone of our production, but check this cool thing out that we're doing that's just like...
Well, to me, it's really cool because normally you produce a base wine, then you add the sugar and yeast later, but the fact that it's one continuous, it also means that it's naturally a little lower in alcohol too. Because of that, it's
1.5% lower.
1.5% lower in alcohol. There's zero sugar added in the dosage.
None.
It drinks so differently than any other, and it's the same fruit. Same exact fruit. It's the same cellar, same team, same winemaking team, same viticulture team, same vineyard team. But because the winemaking style is so different, these wines are just crazy different, and they're so unique. And I've never had anything like these wines.
It was really just to try and capture the essence of the 40th harvest, right? And what's the best
And be able
way
to
do
celebrate
that?
in the year.
And be able to celebrate in the year, because when we're talking about all of these other wines that are produced from an iconic vintage for us, 40 years is a long time to be producing wines. And still having to wait a minimum of 18 months to 3 years before we release the first wines that we're going to get, that's a big commitment. So it was kind of a collaboration and talking back and forth. We had thought about this as a team before. We did it with a proof of concept with 5 cases. Can we tell a story? Can we have fun with it? Can we make something that's different? And can we transfer it to commercial production?
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing is, can you actually make something that, one, you're going to want to stand behind? That's the other thing. I don't like just putting out wines just to put out wines.
Yeah, it's something
you have
that
to stand behind.
you want to be passionate about this innovation idea. Like I said, we come up with like 400 ideas a year.
Yes.
And so we narrow it down to 1 or 2 that we might be passionate about and that we really want to dive into. And I think that's really cool. So we went over the method ancestral.
Yep.
Let's talk about sandstone.
Yeah.
We briefly touched on it, but I don't want to skip over it because I think it is super cool and I think it's super interesting and I think it's something that we're really seeing a lot of promise with, and I want to make sure that we don't skip over that. So talk about first why sandstone and not other materials, and then let's also talk about what you're seeing from the sandstone. We're second vintage now?
Second vintage,
working with sandstone, amphora, and understanding, we were working with barrel for a few years now, sandstone for a few years. Obviously, we have a long history of fermenting in stainless steel. That's kind of our house style.
Yep.
So talk to me about sandstone and then sandstone versus barrel versus stainless. And
yeah, this is kind of an experiment, and I always like to do things in triplicate because when you have 3, there's never going to be a split take, right? You can't say, well, 2 of these were perfect, that means one of them wasn't. So you always have a way when you're doing this, when you're evaluating 3 vessels, you have 3 different purposes, and usually you find your way. Same thing when you're doing things in lab. So it was like, okay, can we set up an experiment? This all came from 2023 when we put the same block of Chardonnay into barrel, into sandstone.
And these are all neutral barrels, right?
All neutral barrels.
So older barrels.
Yeah,
that are,
5+.
Yeah, 5+ years. So you're not getting the oak,
no oak
flavors, but you're getting the oxygenation from the barrel.
It's the oxygen transfer. So barrel was the first thought, right? So you have stainless steel, that's your control. Barrel was the first thought. What else can we use? There's a lot of other vessels out there. There's terracotta, clay pots, things like that. There's concrete. There's plastic. You can use all of these things, but for
plastic, not super romantic, but
not super
it's an
romantic,
option.
but it's an option, right?
Yeah.
And for me, I've used concrete in the past for still wines. I think it provides an awesome linearity to the wines where you have a structure there that it really tends to lean itself to. Truthfully, sandstone was it was something new. It was like, and for me, it's always about trying to learn a little bit. Each vintage, you learn something about the estate, you learn something about the varietals, but it's a way to keep yourself fresh as a winemaker. And not all of these experiments work out, so they always start very, very small. Sandstone came about because its porosity is different than concrete. It's kiln fired at a very high degree so that it's completely inert, so you don't have to seal it. So there's no exchange. And it's just to try and showcase something a little bit differently. We were very successful the first year with Chardonnay. This year, bought a little bit more sandstone, did the same experiment with Chardonnay, did it also with Pinot, in a different block of Chardonnay. So it's like, okay, was it
worked in one block?
Yeah, was it the block?
Does it work in all of them?
Or was it the vessel, right? Yeah. So obviously you go into these things with a thought process and an idea and a hypothesis. And I think it did this for Chardonnay. I think it's going to do this for Pinot. We were so surprised because it did complete opposite things for both varietals. But the reason for doing something like this is, can we add layers of texture to the wines that we are producing for things like Royal Cuvée, Sonoma Brut, other things like that? Sandstone turned out to be such a great experiment that we decided, hey, this is something special. There's a real character to this wine that is different than anything else that we have. Let's produce 100% sandstone sparkling. And when I say small amounts of this, I mean minuscule amounts of sandstone Chardonnay, sparkling wine. I think the first vintage is like 115 or so cases.
Yeah.
Like just enough. And that was limited by the fact that I only had one sandstone.
So you're talking, you're fermenting it in the tank, and then you're also aging it a little bit as well.
Yeah, and that was, whenever you're working with a new vessel or a new varietal, it's like, how are we going to determine how long we let it age for? The best way to do it and the best way is just to taste it.
Yeah.
And I started tasting it weekly. That kind of became information overload where nothing is ever linear in winemaking. You'll often see there's these ebbs and flows. So it's like, I would be like, oh man, we're getting too oxidized, we're getting too oxidized, we're getting too oxidized. And then the next month you'd stir lees and put just a tiny bit of sulfur and it's like, whoop, right back in. And you're like, okay, hold on, So I started tasting it weekly, figured out that was too much information, backed it off to bi-weekly until I got a feel for it, and then kind of moved it.
And then you start to see trends.
Yeah.
Right? It might be going up and down, but it might be going up, or it might be going.
You're looking at the trend
down,
line, right?
yeah.
Just like we do with the grading, right? You're looking at a trend line. If a block scores poorly one vintage, it doesn't get immediately ripped out.
Yeah.
Right? But if it continuously goes down, that's a different story. So it's all about tasting and creating wines that just have a different feel, with the intent to make wines that are either single thread for our innovation, or take that innovation and can we translate it into the wines, evolve the style of the wines that we're making for our larger production wines, right? But a lot of this is great because these wines are earlier to release, so we get much more consumer feedback, right?
Totally.
And it's also just a way to keep it.
Well, because you're trying to highlight. You're not trying to get the aged character. You're trying to highlight. It's the beautifully imbalanced thing, right? It's some of these wines, if you let them age longer, maybe those characteristics wouldn't stand out as much. You'd get more of the yeast aged qualities. But the fact that they're a quick turnaround, they stay fresh, they stay young, and those characteristics that you're trying to highlight are what's being perceived by the consumer and what's in the forefront.
Yeah, and with all these wines, we hold back a couple of cases on the winemaking side, anywhere from 5 to 10 cases, depending on the wine, right? If it's something that we know it needs to be drank young, we're not going to hold back 20 cases and see what happens in a year.
Your
or
method
20
has
years,
to strong.
right?
The goal was to make a wine that you could drink young.
That will have maybe like 2 bottles just because I want to see what's going to happen.
We'll save one for me too.
Well, yeah, and then we always got our stash too. But it's I just want to see what's going to happen. But for these other wines like Barrica, it's like, okay, where's the sweet spot? Also to determine, does this wine need a little bit of cork age? Because that plays into it too, right?
Absolutely.
Like,
if
hey,
it
this
needs
wine
a year, 18 months of age on the cork before it's released.
Way too tight. 12 months in, we're like, whoa, that's really good. Okay, that's when we should actually release it so that we get.
So we know for next time.
That was what we were going for.
And that's why these are small production, because it's all an experiment. It's all innovation. Yeah. It's all learning and honing the craft, right? Is we know what we do really well. We produce fantastic estate-grown, traditional method sparkling wines out of Pinot and Chardonnay, but it's the other stuff where we're still learning, and we want to. And we want to take aspects of some of these innovation wines and use them in our more traditional wines.
That's just it.
And maybe it starts at 1 or 2%, but maybe it gets bigger. But it can offer something to add to those blends. So when you talk about Pinot Blanc or maybe these sandstone fermented and aged sparkling wine, the base wines, they can offer something to a blend. And I think that's important for us to experiment and to learn. So when maybe one day Royal Cuvée is 5%. Sandstone aged and fermented.
Yeah, it evolves the style and without changing what Royal Cuvée is, right?
Helps us learn.
Exactly. Yeah. So we will come back in 2 weeks, and you and I have a fun one coming up. It's a vintage retrospective. You've been working on these library wines with me. We are going to talk about different vintages, how we look at them for growing, what do we do when we're aging, how long do we keep these wines for, and we're going to go through what happens when you're tasting
and how
these
different
verticals.
Weather affects different vintages. How the different vintages affect the different wines.
Yep. So we're going to have a fun lineup here in 2 weeks, so tune back in, and we will see you for a vintage retrospective.
Cheers.